of the number of hits, who's winning.
And that's anywhere in the
And
same thing on the other side.
yeah, the movement is just, well, you've got two players now, the two players instead of just one.
Well, the computer always wins.
Yeah, but like I was saying, if especially if you've introduced BYOB, build your own blocks, then you can have the program construct the initialized routine, and then a repeat until,
Right, so we'll share out in about a minute.
until game over. I call it game over. So one of the guys win, and then within this, so we repeat until hit, okay? Which, and then there'll be, start ball or something, okay? And the start ball will just, move the ball to the center of the court, generate a random angle to start it at. So it's not always going to go one way or the other, it's random. And then here's the end of this repeat. And then here's the end of this repeat. And like I say, it's kind of a celebration in that. Player one wins, player two wins.
Whatever.
Even some statement, costumes.
And it was just so I had to
Let's see.
so
This would be YOB now. See, okay, so you got the background. And you can import it, so if I took this, for instance, I picked this one and said, okay, and it fills that background. So, these are the backgrounds now, this import. I'm trying to think where that, this is nature.
the way I did the way I did it.
Indoors, I think it was indoors. The celebration.
That little breaks,
Yeah, it's got like, yeah, this one right here, I love this one, this is my favorite right here.
What year?
You do this, and here's kind of, so, you can have your guy dance and whatever. And if you do a script on this guy, and you do repeat, let's say repeat,
Yeah.
repeat 10 times. And then I go look under, look. What is the
That's awesome.
As soon as I do that, as soon as I leave, touch it.
Change color effect. Okay, if you do that, let's do it by 50. Well, okay, let's see if I do it by 25. You can change those. So if I put it in a control, I slow it down a little bit. Wait a second. Yeah. If you do it a little bit more dramatically here, you change it by 50. See, you show these little tricks to kids, they pick them up and they love these things,
So I had to kind of work out.
If I change it by 50,
Yeah. It's been all the same. It will be easier.
you control the speed of it, you change so you have the guy dancing and you strike and then you have it.
Well, I will be volunteering. I actually had to do it on a, but then like, so then right. Oh, it kind of, yeah. But I mean, but then I
You play against someone, you got two sets of keys, like A and Z and the up and down here, so it's, you could make it play against a computer, I guess. You could have it, the computer would have perfect knowledge.
Yeah, it's true. It'll always
wouldn't screw up. But,
yeah.
And, I think it's just
And
a
it's just
good
one person.
lesson
You're just
too,
like
and
recommending.
how this works. And it's so simple, I mean.
I don't know.
It really is.
I think
I
my
mean,
season
see, if we just go here, and just see if we put
Yeah.
sensing.
Cool. So let's come back really quick and share. And so I'd love to hear. I think the conversation got animated, which is great. Sorry to cut you off. I'd love to hear just from each group again, like key things that you think will be tricky for kids, or like things that they'll need to have think through or practice ahead of time. And then like any questions that you still have or like that you want to discuss. And actually, if you want to also ask them to each other, like feel free to answer because I think you guys know as much as I do, some of you. So, do you guys want to start?
I'll just start with the, because I know you guys are talking about the ball thing. One of the things that I think that you'd have to decide on from the get-go is, what's going to trigger a goal on either end. I assume you can do two things. One, you can either choose to have like a yellow bar or something like that, like a color yellow or a green bar or whatever you want to do. And if you touch a certain color, point to the other thing. The way I did it was the opposite. Every time I touch a color, it slowed down, so I did away with it. I introduced another sprite, it's just a black bar that matched the background of the game. Couldn't see it, and if it touched that bar, yeah, point to the team, point to the other one. So it really, it's kind of like asking the question, what are you going to have?
Well, you can do it with just touching the edge, and X is greater than a certain value or less than a certain value. So you don't need a sprite or a color, really.
Yeah, good example of a design decision. And then because there are multiple ways to do it.
That's a good way to do
So
it.
something
Yeah,
they'll need to.
well, it teaches the end logic too.
Yeah.
Now, would you do that with the class as a group, try to develop the logic behind the game, or you let the kids develop that on their own?
They develop it on their own, really. I think the more and more you kind of get it to like, hey, this is the only way you can do it, the more you kind of like don't open that idea for them. Because I didn't think about the edge thing.
Well, that's one thing that Mikey, the guy who taught with, was having different approaches. He really, having different ideas.
Yeah, like what you could do is say like, this is something you will need to think about, and that might not be bad. Like, hey, just make sure you're thinking about how the other team will score, and then they can kind of play around with it. They might come up with some things that you don't expect. So.
I think it's a good idea on some of the projects like the phone one to say, initially you build it with, coordinates, but then as a variation of that lesson, you have to use sprites. So they can kind of see the difference and, in their own mind, they might be able to see sometimes where that makes more sense. Because, it might be different goals or something where, a sprite might be preferred because it's a visible item, where other times when it's not visible, it's just adding work. So maybe you can say, okay, if you score on top, it's worth, this point, it's here, right, because it's a smaller block or something. Like if it's some project or something. So you can expose them to one and expose them to the other, and they say, oh, that's when I would use that. It makes more sense.
Yeah.
Compared to, why would I use that?
Right.
Let's do it this way.
Explicitly point out that there are choices and
Right.
trade-offs. Yeah.
Show them the one way, then show them a second way, and then give them good reason to use that other way compared to the original way. So it's like, I have options. I understand why I might use one or the other.
Right. Like what exactly are the trade-offs? Yeah. I like that.
Did it.
What were some of the things that you guys were talking about?
I think you were talking about if the ball gets behind the paddle and kind of ricochets, you get multiple scores, and some of your students will do that. Believe me.
I could definitely see
You
that.
did that?
No, I could definitely see that. I got away from that problem.
Yeah.
I think.
But you gotta, when it hits the paddle, you gotta jump it away from enough, because I guess the way it does it, it evaluates whether it's touching or not when it's finished moving. So it's possible for it to be partially or maybe completely through the paddle, and then you reverse the way and it's still touching, so you reverse it and it just rattles.
Yeah, that is actually a really tricky thing, I think, is the touching.
What I ended up doing to get me away from the paddle was I ended up using the stop this block altogether. So as soon as it did it, it didn't even go into bounce or something. It just stopped.
Yeah.
And that was the only way. It said, if not, it was just bouncing back.
Well, you gotta, if you jump it away far enough, if you point that the other direction, you move out far enough, maybe even do a change X by some number instead of a move, because the move will go in the direction you're going, so you might not move X might not change that much if you're at a very shallow angle, but if you change Y, or change X rather, you're gonna move that distance away from the paddle around again.
Right, yeah, so on
And
the
that's an
bounce, you
important
could
thing.
force,
Yeah, it's an important thing for kids to realize is the move is moving in the direction that the sprite's moving at. Whereas change means you're moving that either in the X direction, change X, or change Y.
Yeah.
And I know, kids get balled up on that. It's a subtle distinction, but
yeah, I think it comes up a little bit in Mario as well, or at least you could make it come up in Mario as well, so that might be a place to.
well, in the facing too.
Introduce it already.
There's those three things on the top, at least in BYOB, that it can rotate around or it can face left or right.
Yeah,
And
you're talking about, this is, I think, worth bringing up. I wonder if I already have it. You're talking about these guys, right?
yeah, right, those three.
Yeah, which can control whether a sprite can rotate or whether it can only face left and right or whether it just can't rotate at all. So that's
Yeah.
like,
I didn't realize it, but you'd make that different for each sprite too.
yeah, that tripped me up a little bit with things like going in circles.
I realized that was the easiest way to do my Mario. Just do the left, right.
So that it can't, yeah,
Yeah, it just eliminates that problem altogether. Just left, right, or else you start getting.
right. So that's like a good one to be aware of. Well, let's just do one more. Like any other like things that you
Well-
foresee or big time problems.
Well, what I actually found this myself, was when the ball hits the paddle at a certain angle, if you just take and point in direction of minus that angle, you get a nice bounce.
Yeah, so that's
So you don't have to do a lot of complex geometry or
Right.
anything like that.
that's one way to just handle the bounce direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it works. It's very simple. You just
You
point
don't
in
have to-
direction
yeah,
of
you don't have to do
minus
too
the
much
direction that it came in at.
geometry with kids, yeah, and stuff like that.
I would say that this probably supposed to be designed. This assignment is designed to be kind of more of like a game, right? I mean, you can have two people go in and play to keep track of scores and stuff like that, right?
Yeah,
So I would say obviously they have to understand variables, which I guess is the underlying thing of this, right?
One of the big things.
yeah,
How to keep score on it, but I would also add that having them start thinking about how to structure the game itself, like maybe how to start a new game, maybe press N or something like that. How to encapsulate this as, N would start a new game, this, how to just, have it to display messages, oh, hey,
Well, again, if you follow that structure we talked about initialize,
Yeah,
repeat until winner, and then have another repeat loop to introduce a ball, and then a congratulatory, or you could ask, do you want to play again? It would come back and do it again. I mean, getting that whole overall high-level system design in there, which I think really is important. It helps me solve that problem. It's not just a bunch of trees,
It's
in the forest.
like think from really small to way back out.
yeah.
Stepwise refinement, I guess, is kind of the technical way of doing it. You start and just keep refining the steps within that.
So yeah, I mean, we could talk about this forever, but I think generally, as you go about these projects, as you seem to be thinking about the right things. Like just be thinking about the decisions you're making. Like what are the steps that are tricky. Whatever frustrates you will definitely frustrate kids. So if there's like a block that's hard to find, or you're like, oh, I didn't realize that I should have been using that one, those are kinds of things I would try to introduce in an earlier project, so that they can realize that that's what they should be using. Cool. So not for the next session, but for the last session, we'll talk through the last projects. So Hangman and Space Invaders. So you have a couple weeks to do it, but take a look at those by then, and definitely before the first day of school. If you haven't done these two projects, do them, because they'll come up kind of earlier, and so you'll want to plan your earlier activities based on that. In the last couple minutes, I want to talk through this last unit. So this is like the overarching unit that is not sequential, so it's on the very back of this packet. And so it transcends everything you're doing, computing in society. So you kind of infuse it as you go, and there are a couple of tools available to you to be able to do that. And so one of them is blown to bits. And so I think most of you guys received this book. Yes. It's a little much to be assigning to a kid to read cover to cover. You probably don't want to do that. But there are aspects of it that might be interesting. So you might go through and assign, like, read this excerpt for homework, and then, you know, answer a certain set of questions, or, like, come in and do a presentation, or various things like that. There's actually, so you picked up a paper that is essentially a lesson plan for a sample of Blended Bits lesson plan, of, like, what you might do. If you go into the curriculum repository, there's like a series of examples of ones that you could use. Bill, do you want to share anything about like what you guys did with Blended Bits?
Well, first semester we did do it, and we only got through 3 or 4 chapters. The second semester we didn't even do it.
What was your what was the reasoning?
We just had other things we'd rather do. We just kept putting it off, and we never got to it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
Well, we did do a couple other culture things. I had hardware. I took some derelict computers they had around here and took them apart and showed them to kids, you know, the different parts of it, the motherboard, the chips, and that. And I also gave a lecture on the history of computing, starting with analog computers to mechanical computers, vacuum tubes, chips, and so on. You know, so
Sure.
we kind of did more of that.
So yeah, you can definitely bring in sort of other things. The other thing you can do is invite coworkers or friends, like do a quick talk, and we'll go through like structure of that when the school starts. But like that's a way to infuse things. Another cool thing that you can do is show videos. The one thing I would say about videos is that if you're showing it, you should have something that they're actually doing while they're watching it. Rather than just being like, we're going to put on this video for 15 minutes, and the kids are going to be like, yes, I'm not doing anything. So you might want to have like a set of questions that they're answering as they go through. You probably also, if it's a longer one, like pause every now and then ask a couple of questions, do a little discussion. And you could also use it as a reward. So you could be like, great, if everyone does their homework, like we're going to watch a 15-minute video, otherwise we won't. And that, you know, that usually works pretty well. There is an example, one of these on, it's in the repository, and I think it's also on the week 5 lesson page on summer training, of like a particular video about Snowden and the NSA, and there's like a cool TED Talk, and it has sample questions that you might ask. It has like a plan for how you would introduce it, a quiz. So if you're wondering like what's a good way to do one of these videos, that's a good place to look.
One thing that we did, the kids really liked, was those TED videos, the TED Talks. They really liked those.
Did you? So when you showed them, how did you? What did you do like around that?
Just talked about it for about 5 minutes afterwards. You know. It really got their attention. They really got into it.
And yeah, it doesn't have to like fill your entire class period, but it could be a cool like shorter activity. So yeah, those are some of the things that are available to you. AP people are starting to show up, and we're gonna have an hour and a half of like whole group stuff, mainly around lesson planning and grading. But let's take like a 5-minute break at this point until a couple more folks show up, and then we will get to that.
Real quick, are we about to write on these things or highlight them, or
I believe you are not,
that's like
because you're supposed to return them. But the recommendation has been to like throw in sticky notes or like something else if you want to annotate.
I thought they were yours, or ours.
So it's a new thing, I think, just because
Come on.
it's become.
Bill Gates is Richard Hill.
I'm not the decision maker on that one.
Kevin.
Maybe that guy, what's his name?
Well, it's on the label, it's like,
Yeah. How's it going?
but
You guys are actually. I'm
I was just dropping her off. See what the school was at the starting at
Okay.
Yeah, we will discuss together. Did you get her email?
Yeah. So you could just do it in class. Alternatively, they just
Take us started. And then we have lessons and then
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
LAFC.
Like 3-4 hours.
It's so great.
Yeah, the second assignment took like 10 hours.
They gonna do that?
It took a long time.
I was
It's
like,
like,
That's low skill, man.
like, oh no, this kid's gonna be, well, they have like several months to do it. Yeah, but still, it's like not that easy.
We're gonna have to do it.
They did all kinds of
Oh,
stuff. Monkey Kong, did you see that?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was done right here. Kids right there. Yeah.
I'm impressed.
It was. The guy did do a nice job of organizing it, playing the music to it.
That
Exactly, it's organized. Build up.
Well, he was, the other guy I worked with, he was a computer science major from University of Pennsylvania, and he worked for Amazon.
But I guess you go along with like, most of the things that are planned out for real. Easier to do that.
So, yeah.
Just
But,
like,
you know, it's kind of easy. We took about 3 or 4 weeks for that one project, and worked with them. They kind of did a proposal and talked to them and business.
So you guys here did, all of those.
We didn't do the Space Invaders, no, we didn't do that. We didn't
Yeah,
do the
today-
cloning or the version and all that. I think we stepped something more to the games like,
So how
what
do
would you call it?
Yeah.
Procedural type of programming that,
Yes, it typically lasts the first year.
no, it's a semester now. I don't know why they did it, but this year, the first semester is 17 weeks. How do you do that? It's crazy.
That's 12.
I don't know how they did it.
Yes. And then the second year.
So the kids were really motivated. 8 o'clock in the morning, we had almost perfect attendance. And they really enjoyed, you know, it's just priceless to watch their smile when they see something work. You know, like, wow, that really worked.
So you had different students.
Okay, I'll call this evening.
Yeah, this 31st semester, another 28 the second semester. Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have a full class next year.
We might will take break.
A couple of them said it was the best class they'd ever taken, don't change anything. One person said, I hate it. We did all kinds of
If you got gut, you'll ask them at the end, you know, what do you think, what were the 3 best things, what were the 3 worst things about the class, what would you change, would you recommend
The
it?
summer session, I had to turn kids away.
That's great.
It's gonna be crazy. We're gonna study the AP book in the summer semester. They're gonna jump in and just do the little intro parts, so they'll know, you know, we're halfway there. We're the other half.
Second,
So, yeah, so we're gonna open up the technology center at the school.
one more, 2 more in person.
So they need everybody
The,
to meet.
wait for them, that's, really long. Yeah. They failed, so college and.
Those were all together. After the AP kids, you know, they came. About 6 of them. So.
Two people there. I'm not sure. It's like we're so. I don't understand how
We went to the magic. Oh, yeah, the AP kids.
Is it every Tuesday though? Really? Oh,
So we're gonna get it.
No, it's like.
Also,
Yeah, I like to imagine.
It's for Tuesdays.
one of my core favorites.
So they have.
Yeah,
their-
Actually, more directly, it's
We had
You guys are
a
Monday.
square, which was hidden,
Monday.
but if the, we didn't trace the cursor,
Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
they got,
Yeah,
you
so
were
probably
within that
just do
square.
Wednesday.
It was like the square.
Friday, because Monday all classes.
Show, and then the key would be hidden in the middle of that. You had to navigate the key.
Really connect with each other and have a lesson planning that's starting the rest of
Remember,
the
if it was hidden,
Okay.
you don't have to, you can't touch it.
and tell you how it works for the intro. I stick to
So, it had them moving around in education now, and then you had to put that max X or min X and min Y, and within that, and then you had to be with the min Y and max graph. So you're within that square, and then you line it up, and you just find the key, and then you do it. Oh, and then, once you got, the other game was once you got that key, you had to take it over and, give it to the drag, it was on the drag. It was a very simple game, I mean, here's the key, you can see it with the drag. So you gotta navigate to get the key, and then you gotta navigate over, touch the drag.
Let's start here.
You had to, when you found the key, you would have to take the swipe.
Oh, yeah.
Draw the key.
the kids are gonna do.
Paint, right? Just through the key, all out.
Okay.
Or-
So if Monday is a short period, it's like a sort of ID.
You could say, you could know whether they had the key or not, probably, little, you didn't have to, have a variable, you're using a costume. You can get the, costume number of a sprite.
That's a school.
Yeah, and it's a very simple thing, but you gotta get all these things right for the kids to do it. I bet the precursor is that Mario, but.
He's not, I didn't remember.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but you can kind of combine the key rules and the ends more, you gotta be in the right thing.
No, he just happened to be.
You just get the key.
But he's actually,
Yeah, he
That's
was.
just our, it has something to talk. What it does, and you don't have all the, you don't have the ID.
I don't know.
I think
Around this first year.
I think kids were 10, 12, 14 years old.
So the control of the class gets
Well, yeah, that, this is all, yeah, it's as
He's a teacher.
As far as directing,
But then he give you
Right.
the classroom.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Very
John,
good.
he's like, engaged.
Great.
So at least it's just not.
Oh, we had.
Never found one.
Hey, wait, those kids.
Like a swing.
And I'm quite
He jumped up.
lacrosse.
He repeats
And
so
he
many
goes down
times.
and he keeps- I know you're not.
And
My family, we feel stuff like it. So there are some.
He knows how this
So it doesn't go through it.
Feels-
Moving the same
So
number.
I remember he went to a whole, they went to a whole something else, was just around.
Depending on your role.
And so like the first couple.
Then they get programmed.
Yeah, I'm working on a little gravity model. That is, and, that's why.
As it gets later on,
Yeah.
it continues. So like,
Well, no.
So it's
Velocity,
and
that's
then
velocity.
when I have a group of six.
also,
And you have that.
From my class.
let me see. Oh, yeah, there you go.
It comes out.
Yeah, we met her, she was at, she's definitely like on board. I think she'll do multiple rides. She's also doing this.
But it's for,
But let me get to Jeremy and just.
And then you're gonna have
Communication,
They're probably,
Go to.
they were my students, and I was the rest of the, they were knocking the door and calling us. So the new people are like, they're gonna take you everywhere you want, we've been there, done that, just deal with it, you know? And then that's a good thing, because we don't get up where they're in groups and teams and collaborative, and that whole thing, and make it happen. But I'll be there
Yes.
for the first few weeks.
Just.
So let me get down somewhere and document it, like, yeah, because our class.
Right, I saw that email that you sent, and then he didn't respond to that.
No.
Gotcha. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's all that.
Yes, of course. It's like-
Here to here, they have to give them-
Yes, I agree, so the administrator said, oh. I was gonna say, she's doing. Between now and next week, I was.
She's teaching. She's teaching.
Right, it should, there should be staff.
Because next grad, that's government, I mean, middle.
Yeah, that, it is a little bit like that, and I know that at least two things that are very serious about this class. Right, and also, it's also, well, I mean, like it's, we have, I mean, right, we have, yeah, we have a set of materials that fulfill this. Right, and yeah, and so I would still plan for this to be. We have a set of materials that fulfills the semester, but what often happens is that you end up taking extra time on this, leads, and then you will do it half a semester, the other stuff. I would plan on taking a picture of everything like in the beginning, where you go, chances are towards the end, a lot of stuff.
It's like that.
So around then you might be available.
Yeah, I read that problem. The other thing that concerns me about staff too is, of course, to use it, you've got to be online. The thing about BYOD,
It's like it's.
the internet is down, and it's still use it. So it depends on how the business your network. Pretty good. There are days when it's down.
But I will, I get to Jeremy this week.
Yeah.
Is our next training?
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, I'll add these, but it
Download. PC.
yeah, sorry, it's a little bit flexible like that, good questions, you'd ask them.
My recommendation is yes. Actually, this place has 3 high schools in it. Yes, the SQA, which is the one all the way down on the right-hand side down here. And then there's 2 LA Unified School Districts, high schools here. Social justice or something, you know.
Only 2 weeks away.
But I think we can
I don't know if
move to our other part.
each school or not, it's pretty good size. You know, you can see the 3 separate buildings.
Oh, I just put it together. So, well, now that you say that, it's like, that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know if one is performing social justice, performing arts, and other ones
some other, I don't know that much about the TLU. Again, ours is a charter school.
Nothing to get over. I'm in.
Works real well.
Oh, I see.
If you take that, they can.
Well, I think charter schools get kids that are, well,
That's a better idea.
The way it's
For
supposed to
recycling. I
work.
like your thinking. For recycling.
And they randomly pick people, so in a sense,
But
there
there
was
was
a,
a way to-
there was a little, there's a little filter there on who applies. But you have not sure. We'll only take the students who had something such
there
support.
were kids that had to go out the way.
Yeah, well, that's right. There is a filter.
Okay, so we're gonna get started on the middle portion, which is sort of whole group. So there's some AP folks here now, intro folks are already here. And then around 4 o'clock, intro could take off and we'll look specifically at the AP curriculum and the first project and things like that. So just wanted to put out a couple of announcements. So hopefully you guys have at least tried to meet with your team. Some of you are here now in our meeting. But you know, at least like know who else on your team. Start thinking about like the schedule of like who's going to come in what day, and make sure you're on the same page about that. And sort of roles, like are all of you going to share teaching responsibilities? Do you want to set up more of a teacher-TA dynamic? That kind of thing. A lot of classroom teachers are not in town, but when as soon as you can, if you can meet with them and kind of get on the same page with them too, and just see how comfortable they are leading. So some of them, I think in most cases, have no computer science experience already, so they're going to be more of like a student in class, content-wise. But we'll be doing a lot of like classroom management, like definitely jumping in that respect. But we'll be expecting you to lead on like planning lessons and delivering them.
Are those teachers going to that summer school at Berkeley?
Yes, most of all the intro ones, yeah. I think pretty much all of them went. So they're coming in with some knowledge in that respect. But they haven't ever taught computer science before. Alternatively, like some of them might be comfortable being sort of a TA or helping with grading or various things. So like when you have that conversation, you just kind of gauge like, you know, how much are they willing to jump in. Other things you want to think about are your sort of like background check volunteer paperwork. So most of the time that involves going to the district and getting a form and then like submitting a TB test and a fingerprint thing. I think if you have a TB test in the last 4 years, it's still good, so you don't have to necessarily get it again. But just like things that, if you haven't already heard, maybe just reach out to your classroom teacher and ask like, what do I need to do?
The school pays for that.
Yeah, if they don't pay for it directly, the school pays everybody a $1,250 stipend, and part of that is like intended to cover things like this. So either way, you're getting something back from the school that it will exceed the amount of the background check or whatever it is. Has everyone been able to get on the dashboard? Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You guys are able to get on the dashboard? Great. Okay. So that's like all the summer training stuff is there, resources. There's a discussion forum if you want to ask questions to other people. The training calendar is up there, and so if I think you would default to Los Angeles calendar, but if you want to check and see like where the next sessions are, that is where to check. We're at the point where everyone should have finished the first half of the curriculum project. So for AP, that's just project 1. For intro, it's project 1 and 2. And so in our session, we'll look at project 1 and like go through best practices for presenting that. You should have received books. And if you didn't, there's another round of them going out. Actually, yeah, this week. But hopefully you did. If you didn't, let me know, and I'll make sure that they go to you this time around. Yeah, that's pretty much general stuff. Any questions? Great. Okay, so what we're doing in this part of the training is looking particularly at grading and lesson planning. So we're going to look at like some lesson planning resources, actually like go through planning a really quick lesson. And then we're going to grade some things using a few different strategies as well, so you can get some idea of like grading strategies you might use in your classroom. These build off of the online lesson planning and grading modules, so if you haven't had a chance to look at those, go back and look at them, and it'll kind of tie into what we're doing right now. So we're going to start with a grading activity. the lesson planning homework in the module looked like this. If you have your own on you, I would use yours, but if you don't, there's a sample one up there that you can use. And the idea behind this is to practice self-grading. So self-grading is when you give kids a rubric and you're like, grade your own paper. It's effective for making kids like think about what they did and actually learning from their mistakes. Less effective in like grading for correctness. So you might do this for like a homework assignment or like an in-class activity where you really want them to learn, but you care less about like collecting the grade and putting it in the grade book. So let's take a couple minutes and go through this exercise. So this is the grading rubric that I'm giving you for this. Go through and just like self-grade either your paper or the sample one. And think a bit about like if you were a student, you know, what you'd be thinking, how this is set up, like what parts are helpful, what parts are confusing. And then we'll go through what it looks like to go over that afterwards. So let's say like 2 minutes. Oh yeah.
Come back.
Yeah.
Was this on the website? Because I found the learning objectives. I did not find this one.
Yeah, it should have been. It should have been under week 4. There was like a couple videos, and then there was this worksheet. Yeah, this is the in-person week 3. But the online stuff is like at a slightly different order.
Okay, I'm confused.
Yeah.
I didn't look at this at all because this is
Yeah,
week 4.
it's weird because the week I'm looking at is the Seattle calendar for training. And Seattle is just on training with us. So we,
I didn't look at this at all.
yeah, which is okay.
Okay.
But if you go, because we talked about this in the last training, but if you go to the homepage of training, there's like this thing called like the Southern California training program. And it outlines like week by week the schedule that we're on. So it's slightly off of the order of things.
Okay.
Which is kind of confusing, but yeah. It's the network is SQA1. And the password is SQA happy exclamation point. All of these.
Sorry, SQA.
SQA happy exclamation point.
Lowercase or doesn't matter?
All lowercase, yeah. Okay, so normally you might give more time to do this grading activity, but I more want to model the actual like process of how you do it. So we're going to go through how you would, like once you had kids self-grade, like how you would go over it in class. And so the purpose of the self-grading is for kids to realize, like, did I get this right, and yes or no, and why. So I might say something like this. Okay, great. So for question 1, you get 1 point each for having a well-formed lesson objective. So can somebody share out one of the things that makes a lesson objective well-formed?
It starts with students will be able to.
Great, yeah. So a well-formed lesson objective starts with students will be able to. So if the objectives that you wrote don't start with that, then don't award yourself a point. Are there other things besides that that make a lesson objective well-formed?
It has those certain verbs.
Is the, about knowledge, comprehension.
Analyze.
So right, it has a verb that is on Bloom's taxonomy, like related to learning. So, sorry, say that again?
Measurable verb.
Yes. So it has a measurable verb. So it might be like describe or define or create or something like that. So if your objectives have that, now that's something that you are moving towards giving yourself a point for. Is there anything else that a well-formed learning objective should have?
Well-defined objective, I mean.
Yeah, well, what are some of the things that you might define in your learning objectives? So you're saying like students will be able to, name and define the arithmetic operators. Is there anything else about that that you might put in your learning objective? Perfect. Yeah. So like the actual activity by which they will demonstrate that they can do it. So I mean, it's more for almost your own planning purposes too, that you think through like, I want them to be able to do this, but how am I going to measure it? By having them do this activity. So if your learning objective had students will be able to, a measurable verb, and then an example of an activity, then you should give yourself a point. And so that's like essentially how you might go over this. And then you get an additional point if you justify why. So if you had a statement that said like why you made those changes, then you get a second point. And so the second question is having an assessment that aligns to the lesson objective. So what does it mean that your assessment aligns to the lesson objective?
You're actually giving them something that is in the scope of putting on.
Yep, so it's within the scope of the objectives you earlier defined. Anyone want to add anything there? So you're essentially looking for something that they can do. Like if they've mastered those objectives, then they should be able to do the thing. There isn't like, it's not assessing ability to do something else. So it's sort of related to like measuring, like the result of that should be able to tell you whether or not they learned those things that you wanted them to learn. And so if you had something like that, then you give yourself 3 points. And so we would continue doing that sort of throughout. Aligned activities is a similar idea, like having an activity for which you're actually getting an idea of whether they learned that thing and not something else. And so we won't go over that, but that's like generally how self-grading would work. It's like you're looking for kids to just sort of talk through the rubric, understand whether or not they're understanding, less so to be like, this is the grade I'm going to give you on your grade book. So I wouldn't do this for a test or a quiz, but you could do this for like a homework or like a warm-up activity or something like that. Questions about self-grading or about the worksheet? Cool, okay. We're going to look at one other type of grading, and this is peer grading. This one's cool because it also saves you time. So self-grading saves you time because you don't have to like go home and grade all these papers and give them back. Peer grading does too, but there's an added advantage here where kids have to get good at reading someone else's work and like understanding it. So particularly in AP, they encounter a lot of questions where it's like, here's a code snippet, like figure out what it does. Or alternatively, like, here's a code snippet that doesn't work. Like, what's the line that's causing it not to work? Or like they might ask you, like, does this compile? There's like various stuff like that. And so this is a chance to give them practice with reading somebody else's code that may or may not be correct. And having to like figure out what that person is thinking, what it does, stuff like that. So if you want to practice that skill, this is a way to do it while also having them like reflect on the thing that you taught. So to model this, we're going to look at a sample quiz. So this is actually an AP quiz. Let me clarify a few things. So there's two define statements that like define these two terms. And then it says, write the following using cascaded if else and nested if else, which for the sake of time we're not going to do. So I'm going to have you guys take this quiz But the parts that you're going to do are just define these two things, and then write this using cascaded if-else statements. So don't worry about nested. If you want, you can write it sort of as though you were a student, or like introduce some errors and things like that. Like think through what would actually make it realistic, and then we'll actually peer grade it, and like you can think about that experience and like how you would facilitate it for students. So let's take like 3 minutes to take this quiz. If you don't finish, that's okay. And then we'll peer grade it. So 30 more seconds. So that's how far you got. As long as you got a couple of these if statements down, that'll be fine because we want to go a little bit anyway. But what we're going to do now is we're going to exchange papers and grade each other's. So if you want to exchange within your table, and then we'll go through how this would work. So, and so when you're doing this with kids, there's a couple things that could potentially go wrong. So you're gonna like ask them to exchange papers. I would give them clear directions of like who to exchange with. So what's often gonna happen is like, where's my friend? And like, I'm gonna walk around and I don't want to. So you might say like exchange with the person to your left, or like, you know, switch with the person directly in front of you, behind you. So have some like, that's like number one thing that might go wrong. So have a clear procedure there. The next thing you probably want to have kids do is write on the top of the paper that they're grading that they are grading it. And that way, if they, you know, make it very clear, like if this looks like you're cheating or you're giving your friend points or whatever, that like both kids are going to get a 0. So if you set that expectation right at the beginning, you won't have a problem with this. If you don't, you might continue to have a problem. So then it's like, okay, we want to go over these things and have kids grade them. How do we do that? So for the first ones, I might say, okay, great. Can someone tell me like what a definition of a compound condition is? Either like what you think it is, or you can also share what's on your paper.
Take condition and then combine them and or.
So he says take conditions combined with binary operators. Does anybody disagree? Okay, great. So if that's what's on your paper, give that person a point.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So it's right. The other thing I would avoid doing is asking kids to deduct points. So if you're like, instead of saying like if it's wrong, take off points, you could say something like if it's right, add points. Because otherwise, I don't know, it sets a more a positive vibe. Also, the AP exam in particular is scored in that way, where you earn points, but you don't necessarily lose them. So it gets them in the habit of that. Can someone define what a predicate is?
The expression evaluates the true or false.
Does anybody disagree? Okay, so yeah, that, well, okay.
No.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, that is the correct answer. Does anyone have something on the paper that they're not sure about? Like they're like, this might be correct too. Okay, so that's like another question you could ask to kids, because a lot of times they're going to be like, well, I don't know, is this right? So then you'll bring out like more stuff that you can talk about. So okay, if that's what you had, give your person a point. Otherwise, leave it as it is. So for code things like this, the best thing that works is to have someone come up and write it on the board. And you might even have like multiple kids come up and write their answers on the board and then talk through them. We don't have a board, so here's an alternative thing you could do. I dislike, let's just open this. So alternatively, you could do something which is called like teacher drive student share. So you're essentially having a kid dictate to you what to type. And you open up a text editor and you're like, okay, great. So like here we are. Could someone explain to me what I should type for the first one?
Computer projector.
I believe that's a good question to ask. I believe you guys will all have projectors, but it's worth asking. If not, you could alternatively go to the board and be like, "Hey, tell me what to write." It's like a good practice for kids to get used to explaining their code.
It also takes the pressure off the kid who goes to the front of the classroom and be nervous.
True. Yeah, exactly. And it's going to be collaborative too. Like you can have someone tell you one part and someone else tell you one part. So someone just like read to me the first line.
What we've done is give them raffle tickets. If they answer a question or participate, you give them a raffle ticket.
So you'll actually get, TEALS will actually send you a box with the raffle ticket and some prizes. And so you can choose to use them how you will, and one way is to encourage participation.
Every week then we just take the names in the box and pull it out and give them a prize.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, it's a fine line between what you are and aren't incentivizing. But if you can incentivize the right things, then yeah, you could. That's like an option.
Well, you try to not call them the same person all the time.
Yeah, I think for participation, it's a good incentive, and not so much things that are like based on intellect. But yeah, that makes sense. Great. So.
If none is less than 0, really bracket none times -1, semicolon.
Okay, so I have this, and then I have this.
And I did a underline edit system. Bracket num close bracket semicolon.
Okay. So
close curly bracket.
Perfect. So this is like something that might happen, right? Is that you're like, okay, well, I wrote exactly what they said. Perhaps not exactly syntactically correct, but like that's like part of the exercise is to be like, okay, well, this is what I wrote. So would anyone change something about this?
Change the is less than to
Sign.
To this, right?
Yeah.
Would anyone change anything else? Perfect. So, I mean, essentially the point of the exercise is that now you're getting all this conversation around like, okay, this is exactly like the parts and all this stuff. And then so you might say, okay, if you have all of these aspects, if it looks like this, then they get a point. And then kids are going to be like, well, what if I have this, what if I have that, what if I have that, and you can kind of discuss it. In general, syntactical things like semicolons, I would say, are less important than like getting the operator right, getting the computation right.
Unless you ask why it doesn't,
Right. So it kind of depends on what you're talking about, but that's like typically how this works. So you would go through this for the rest of the thing, and then you'd say, okay, like exchange papers again, and then kids get a lot out of looking at it right then and being like, okay, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? If you collect papers and return them in a week, they probably won't look at it.
So I'm just struggling to visualize how you do that with a snap languages where you're drawing boxes and throwing things in. I mean, it isn't coding.
Right.
Se.
In terms of like how you would have them take a written quiz.
Or just give them homework. Say, hey, write you want to do this, how would you represent that?
It's a little bit tricky. So one thing you could do, or that I've seen people do, is print out a paper that essentially has a series of blocks laid out, and then says like, okay, assemble these things to make a program that does whatever it does, and then you could even like call them something short. Like you could say this is A, this is B, and just like put these in the right order so that it would do what you want it to do, and that would be like one way. Or even like draw these blocks so that it does what it wants to do. You could print out various blocks and say like, what does it do, or which of these does this thing. So there are a couple ways like that. And then in class, when you're modeling, it's actually really great to pull up Snap and say like, hey, I'm trying to make this happen, like tell me what blocks to use. And that's like super visual and that's essentially what they're doing anyway.
What we've done too is put a say statement in there. Which one of these two will he say under these conditions?
Yeah, similar to print. So yeah, it's like you got to be a little more creative, but kind of get at the same ideas. Do you guys have any questions about peer grading or self-grading? Okay. I would encourage you to try it. A lot of people are like, I don't think this will work. Try it a couple times, and then if it doesn't work, you can move away from it. But it usually works out pretty well.
It's partial credit. I mean, what about it? Did you want to give? I mean, if it got syntactically exactly right, would you give them more credit?
It would depend on what your intent is with the assignment. If it's an assignment where you intend to put the grade in the gradebook, I would collect it and I would look over it again. But if the assignment is like something you did in class and you just kind of want to go over it, it doesn't really matter. Like you might never actually put that grade in. So I think that's like, if you're intending to grade it for real, I would go over it again anyway. Okay, so the next portion of this probably will consume most of the rest of the time. Is actually we're going to look at lesson planning and like collaboratively write a lesson plan, so you can kind of like see what that process looks like. And we're going to do it quickly so that hopefully you'll also like, if you're you don't have to spend tons of time on lesson plans essentially. Like we'll do one and show that it can be like pretty fast. So in all of our classes, the breakdown will look something like this. You don't really want to spend more than 25% of your instruction on lecture. In AP, there might be days when you go a little over that. In intro, for the most part, you probably wouldn't, because a lot of it's just practicing. There's not that much to lecture about. And so your lecture is a combination of like actual new concepts and then also maybe like demos, modeling code, showing things, leading a discussion, having kids read something. And then the rest of your class is practice, and they're like doing a lab activity, taking a quiz, doing some kind of project, things like that. And so when you're creating a lesson, the structure is generally like some kind of warm-up activity, like intro kind of thing, my lecture, and then it's just practice. And your practice is sort of gradual release, so you might start with an activity that's still kind of like you're holding on to them a little bit, so it might be something like what we just did, where you're like, tell me how to write this code. And that's practice, but kids aren't off on their own yet. And then after that gets good, you might say, okay, perfect, well now that you've seen how to do it, you're going to work on this aspect of your project, or you're going to write this lab. So when you're planning a lesson, you kind of have to think about what all these parts are. If anybody watched the video, in what direction should you be thinking about these things? And essentially, forwards or backwards?
I guess it's student
Because
choice.
backwards if you're asking it.
Yeah, good answer. Yeah, clever. So you actually, you actually want to think about it backwards. And so you want to be like, at the end of class, what do they need to be able to do? And then like, okay, what's the activity I'm going to have them do? And then what is the stuff I need to include in lecture to set them up? Because otherwise, if you think about it forwards, you're going to talk forever and tell them probably too much stuff. But if you can scope it to like, this is what they need to do, then it's easy to say, all right, these are the few things I need to tell them. So we're going to go through that whole exercise right now, so that you can like go through and plan your own lessons that way. And a lot of times for you, like you'll have an activity already, and you'll just have to plan the lecture part. So in this case, this is what we're going to do. There's two objectives here, one for intro, one for AP. Both of them are like relevant to something you might actually teach. So for intro, the objective is that students will be able to use repeat blocks to draw shapes that have repeating patterns. That might be like regular shapes, spirals, things that you've been talking about. And for AP, they should be able to initialize a 1D array and manipulate elements. And so those are like the two things we're trying to teach. So I'm giving you the lab activity that they should be able to do at the end. So at the end of the class, the intro kids should be able to create an n-gon, so like n number of sides, that's regular.